Hi everybody, welcome back to the channel. I'm really excited to bring you the continuation in this series today. We've got loads of important stuff to be looking at. We're going to be looking at normalizing region gain. We're going to be looking at phase cancellation, mono compatibility, top down and bottom up mixing, and some other stuff that I can't even remember right now. So let's get into it. Before we kick off today, if you're a fan of the channel and you like my content, please give this video a thumbs up. Make sure you hit the subscribe button when you're new and the notification bell so you know when all the future videos come out. If you're looking to buy any new gear or equipment for your studio and you have the ability to shop online, then please use Toman. I've got an affiliate link up there or there. It's linked down in the description below as well. It doesn't cost you anything extra. It just means that a little bit gets kicked back to me, which helps me keep doing what I'm doing. You can also subscribe to my Patreon if you would like to do that as well. Again, description is down below. Okay, let's get into it. So last time we were exploring predominantly starting to gain stage and using the VU meter technique so that we were trimming each of our channels to try and hit around about the 0 dB VU mark, which in theory, hypothetically, was going to give us a level of minus 18 dB full scale on our meters. Let's talk about that a little bit more because it's not quite as simple as that. What I'll do is to instantiate a gain plugin on each of my channels. So I've got a gain plugin on each channel. And what you'll see is that when I trim some of these things according to that technique, I can't get anywhere near that 0 dB VU mark without clipping wildly. Let me demonstrate. So I'm just going to solo out this snare top. Let me trim that. And look, to get to 0 dB VU, I'm clipping by 7 dB, which clearly isn't what we want. So why is it that I'm telling you in one session that we want to be trimming to 0 dB VU, and then in the very next session I'm doing the exact same thing, but then I'm clipping by 7 dB? That clearly doesn't work, does it? Well, in order to understand why, we need to understand the different sorts of meters that we've got in front of us, okay? So the meters that you've got on your channels are peak or full scale meters. They work really, really quickly, very, very fast. They respond much faster than the human ear does. So from that standpoint, they're very unnatural, okay? They're also still very important because when we're working in the digital domain, the digital clipping point at 0 dB at unity is a very important measure. We don't want to go above that because then we risk introducing digital distortion. So we need to be aware of that. But in terms of how we perceive things as a human, which is how we listen to stuff, it's not a very useful measure. The VU meter is much more useful as a measure of how we perceive sound because it's a much slower responding measure. It's much more akin to how the human ear responds. So in terms of it kind of feeling natural, this is a good measure. However, it relies very heavily on the input signal being relatively consistent. So what you'll find is if your input signal is something like a pad sound or perhaps a string sound with some nice sustain or a bass sound that's got nice sustain to it, you'll very comfortably be able to hit that 0 dB VU on the meter and also be in the realms of that minus 18 dB full scale level on your meters. Not a problem. For signals that are much more dynamic, that have a much larger transient but a very wide dynamic range, like all of your percussion parts, especially, or perhaps like a staccato piano part, or perhaps like maybe even a really articulate vocal, it will be much more difficult to get in that sweet spot. So what we need to do is use our kind of better judgment and try and find the best compromise we can. Now, clearly, with this snare drum here, I can't get anywhere near this 0 dB VU point because, as I just showed you, I end up clipping a whole load. So what do I do? How do I go about trying to find the best happy medium? Well, the answer to that is you can use a function called normalize region gain. That's what it's called in Logic, at least. In your DAW, it'll be called something different, but your DAW will probably have a similar function to this. And what it'll allow you to do is to normalize any tracks that you tell it to hit a designated peak level so that it'll basically analyze all of the information in a track and say, right, I'm not going to go above this peak level. So you can basically tell it, right, the loudest peak on, for example, this snare track is going to be no more than 8 dB full scale. So let me show you how it works. What I'm going to do is I'm going to select all of the regions in this project. Okay, I'm going to go to Functions, Normalize Region Gain. Now you've got a few different things to work through here, so let's go through them one at a time. The effect. Firstly, you're choosing what it's going to analyze. So as default, it selects collective selection, which means it's going to look at everything all as one. That's not what I want. I want it to look at individual tracks. So I want it to analyze each track at a time as its own independent thing and work out what to normalize from there. You could also, if you had individual regions on tracks, choose the individual regions option. It's good for other purposes, but for this purpose, individual tracks is what I want. You've got two algorithm options, peak or loudness. Peak is what I'm concerned with now, so I'm going to choose the peak algorithm. And then you select your target level. So I'm going to say I don't want anything on any track peaking any higher than -8 dB full scale. So what that does is to analyze each of these tracks individually, find the biggest peak, the loudest peak, and make that -8 dB. So when I hit apply here, you'll see each of these regions adjust a little bit according to whether they need to become louder or quieter to make the loudest peak -8 dB. Let's hit apply now. And there we go. You see that each region is adjusted. So I can show you on the region trim here, the kick has been trimmed up by 0.7 dB, the snare down by 5.4, the snare bottom down 3.5, the hats up by 1.6, and so on. So each region has been, or track, which is the algorithm we selected, each track has been normalized individually to make the loudest peak -8 dB. So now when I play, you'll see that no one of these tracks is going to go any higher than -8 dB. And you'll see that none of these tracks have actually gone to -8 dB. The overheads was the closest at -8.1, and that's because presumably the loudest peak, the biggest peak on each of these tracks isn't in these first 4 bars. It comes later on in the track. So wherever that peak comes, that'll be the loudest point. So what that does is basically to automatically trim any of these tracks as loud as I possibly can, still giving myself a good amount of headroom, and basically means that they're trimmed as hot as I can, irrelevant of what's going on in the VU meter. So for transient heavy material like percussion, like anything that is kind of really staccato or has a really wide dynamic range, the normalized region gain option is a really, really great option to gain stage so that you're in the right place. And it will automatically give you that balanced starting point. Now remember, the reason that we're doing this gain staging is to try and get into the sweet spot for plugins, because we want the signal that we're sending through plugins to be in the right kind of signal range that the plugins work at their kind of maximum effectiveness. They work in the best way they were designed to do so. So that's what we're achieving here with this normalized region gain option. We're automatically taking the thinking out of gain staging and putting all of these channels in a good place straight away. The next thing we're going to check out is something called phase cancellation. Now, phase cancellation, very simply, is when one waveform cancels out the sound being made in another waveform. The reason it happens is because two waveforms are moving in opposite directions, in contrary motion. So when one is moving up, the other is moving down. What does that mean? If you've got no idea what that means, let's find out. So I'm going to solo out just the snare tracks here, the snare top and snare bottom. Why I'm doing that will become apparent very shortly. So I'm going to zoom in on this single snare hit right here. Let's zoom in nice and closely. Now you'll see that as the snare top moves up, it goes up, the snare bottom goes down. As the snare top goes down, the snare bottom goes up. What that means is these snare signals are working against each other. They're basically cancelling each other out. They're not cancelling each other out entirely because they sound different. If they sounded exactly the same, then they would cancel each other out completely. But because they share lots of similar content, parts of that content is cancelling each other out. The reason for that is that when this snare has been recorded, the snare top has a microphone on the top and the snare bottom has a microphone on the bottom. So when the snare is hit, they're basically moving in opposite directions as the diaphragm responds to that snare hit. So when you hit it, that microphone is going to go up and that microphone is going to go down. So that's why you get this contrary motion. What we need to do to solve that is to flip the polarity on one of the microphones. We can do that very easily with the gain plugin. And in fact, I've still got all these gain plugins instantiated here. I'm not using any of them, so I'm going to remove them all. Get rid of them all, with the exception of one on my snare bottom. And you'll see it's got this phase invert option on the plugin. Now I'm going to flip the phase on that snare bottom, and you'll hear the low end, the bottom, come back into the signal. So it's off, and then I'll bring it in. You hear how a little bit more of the tone comes in when I invert that phase. So that's a really important thing to check. And you want to check for phase cancellation on any source that has multiple microphones on it. So if you've got a kick drum with a kick in and a kick out, perhaps you've got multiple mics on a tom. Sometimes you might do a tom top and a tom bottom. Sometimes you might put two microphones on an acoustic guitar, on a piano, anything where you're using multiple mics. You want to check for phase cancellation. That's really, really important. Now, the other thing that we want to check here is that we've got an option in our DAW ready to go called pre-fader metering. Now, by default, our faders in our mixer here are set up as what's called post-fader. What that means is the meter comes after the fader. So any adjustment we make on our fader is going to be reflected on the meter. So if we just solo out the kick, for example, you'll see that as I pull the fader down, the meter will turn down with it. Okay, that's called post-fader metering. So what you adjust on the fader is reflected on the meter. When we come to mixing, that's not the most helpful thing to have there. The reason being that when we make adjustments in plugins, so for example, if we put an EQ on here, or if we put a compressor or anything else, we want to be able to ensure that we're gain staging through those plugins, through our signal chain correctly. If we've got an adjustment made on our fader here, then we won't be able to accurately know how we're affecting our gain structure through our plugins. Let me evidence that for you. So let's just, for sake of simplicity, put a gain plugin here. Okay. Now, let's say I've made an adjustment of whatever, minus 7.1 dB on that kick. When I now play, if I adjust this fader, I don't know what my signal was before the fader adjustment. Because the number it meters is after what I do with this fader. Conversely, if I enable pre-fader metering, which I'll show you how to set up in a moment, what it means is that regardless of what I do with the fader, it's still showing me the signal that is coming out of the plugins before the signal hits the fader. So I'm peaking at like minus 18. I'll turn it all the way down. Still peaking at minus 18. That's really, really useful if, for example, I want to ensure that my input and output level of an equalizer, of a compressor, of a saturation or distortion plugin is the same in order to maintain my gain structure going through my signal chain. It's a really, really important thing. What I don't want to do is, for example, put a compressor on this channel and then all of a sudden, having spent the effort to make sure that the channel's not going to go any higher than minus 8 dB full scale, put a compressor on, boost the output signal too much and end up going up to minus 3, minus 2 dB. That's not what I want. And if I've got my fader adjusted because I've already balanced my elements, I'm not going to see that reflected in the numbers it's metering at me. So this pre-fader metering is a really, really important option. How do you set it up? So in Logic Pro X, if you don't see it here in your toolbar already, this little fader icon, then all you need to do is go to your Customize Control Bar and Display menu, and it's here in the right-hand side, Pre-Fader Metering, and you just toggle it on and off, okay? And then when you hit that on and off, you'll see that the order of the meter and the fader gets swapped round. So for post-fader metering, the meter is after the fader. For pre-fader metering, they're swapped. So the meter comes before the fader, hence pre-fader. It's a really, really useful and important tool that's going to help you maintain your gain structure throughout your whole signal path and keep you in control of your mix all the way through. Okay, so now let's look at a couple of different mixing techniques. We'll start with what's called a top-down mixing technique. Now, top-down simply means you start with the bigger groups of instruments and then you supplement it with the smaller groups. So in the case of these drums here, I'm going to start with the rooms, and then I'm going to bring in the overheads, and then I'll bring in the spot mics after the fact. So what I'm going to do is bring down everything other than the rooms. I'm just going to work from the rooms, and then I'm going to bring in the other elements one at a time. I'll start with the next biggest group, which is the overheads, and then I'll bring in the kick, the snare top and bottom, and the other things as I want to hear them. So let's do that. Whilst I'm doing this, the other great thing to mention at this point is if I'm doing this with our pre-fader metering on, there are a couple of big benefits. Benefit number one is I know that the loudest I can go below unity with the fader is -8 dB full scale. Okay, so if I go all the way up to unity with a fader, I know that at no point is it going to go above -8 dB full scale because I've already normalized the region gain. That's number one big benefit. So anything below that, I know, is in safe territory. Right? I know that I'm not going to be clipping anything at all. The other thing is, because I'm pre-fader metering, as we already have established now, what I do with the fader doesn't affect what I'm seeing on the meter. So I'm not kind of fooled by my ears as to thinking, oh, well, that's metering a lot, so I'm hearing it a lot, or that's not metering very much, so I'm not hearing it very much. I'm forced to use my ears to mix components in. So I'm really listening to the track and going, how much of that do I want to hear? It's a really, really crucial thing. Whereas if you're on your post-fader metering, you bring something in, you go, okay, well, that looks like it's enough. Looks like it's enough on a meter is meaningless, right? If you're on the pre-fader option, it means that the meter is doing the same thing, regardless of the fader. So you have to listen for exactly how much of it you want, and it really makes you focus on what you're actually doing in your mix and how you're actually building that mix. It's a really cool thing. Okay, I'm going to bring in the kick now. And you'll see I'm A-Bing the sound using the mute button to hear it in and out to see if I like the level that it's at. Now I'm not hearing enough of that snare top, so what I'm going to do is grab the elements that I've already got in and I'm going to pull those down. And now I like where that snare top is. Cool. Okay. Now I'm going to find a section with the toms in somewhere. Let's go to this little couple of bars here. Okay, now we get to that point there, and that's where this China part comes in. I don't even think I need any of it. Maybe the tiniest amount. And then this hi-hat part, let's have a listen to that. There's so much other stuff on that I'm just going to leave that out entirely for the time being. Don't think I want it. Okay, so that is a top-down method. What that gives us is a really kind of organic sound where we're starting from the rooms, we're starting from the overall sound of the kit, and we're blending the other parts in. The opposite of that is the bottom-up method where we start with the close mics, the spot mics, and we build our kit sound from there. So let's do that now. So the exact opposite, I'm going to bring down everything. I'm going to start from my snare top. Let's just grab that first loop again. Let's put the snare top at unity. I've ended up with much less snare bottom in that arrangement than I did previously. That's interesting. Overheads now. Rooms. And let's find those toms again, that little tom fill. Interesting. So I've come up with a quite different balance there, with actually my overheads and rooms being quite a lot quieter and a more immediate kind of direct sound. Now, neither the top down or the bottom up is right or wrong or better or worse, but they give you different sounds because you build that mix in different ways. So it's interesting to experiment with both those options and see which one you kind of prefer. See if you prefer the result that you get from one over the other. Next thing we're going to do is pan some elements on this drum kit. Now, the kick and the snare I'll always leave right down the center of the mix. I'm not going to touch those, but I've got toms that need some panning, and also I've got this china that needs some panning. I would also pan the hi-hats if I was using it, but I'm not. So in order to identify where the toms are going to pan, I need to listen to where they are in the overheads. I need to know if they're positioned to the left or the right in the overall image of the kit. So let's have a listen to that. Let's just turn this up so that we can hear it for the time being. So I can clearly hear that first tom is a bit to the left and the next tom is further over to the right hand side. I want to copy that with the positions of these toms here. So I'm going to put the first tom a bit to the left, and then I'm going to put the second tom a bit more to the right. I've then got this china, which is also over here. Now, it's really important that you position any spot mics, any individual mics that you have in your drum kit, as close to the same position as you can hear them in the overheads. Because what that means is that they're going to support each other. If, for example, you had your floor tom on the right hand side and your overheads, as we do here, but then I pan it, the spot mic, over on the left hand side, they're going to fight each other and it's going to sound weird. It's going to sound conflicting. Let's just demonstrate that. Let's just pull this floor tom over this side. Let's mute that chime. It sounds like I've then got two floor toms. I've kind of got the one in the overheads, which is over here, and then I've got the direct one, which is over here. It's weird. So it's really important that you keep those things supporting each other. You keep things in the correct positions as they were recorded. Last thing I'm going to check at this point is my mono compatibility. Now, for all sorts of reasons, when someone listens to your music, it might be summed to mono. I won't worry you with the reasons, but it happens sometimes, and it's not the listener's fault at all. So you need to ensure that your mix, your track, is going to be what's called mono compatible. What that means is that when the left and right channels of your mix are folded down, summed to one, you don't have phase cancellation issues. The exact same phase cancellation issues that we were talking about with our snare top and bottom or multiple mics, the exact same thing applies when you combine the two signals from the left and right speakers into one. We want them to be adding up together and not cancelling each other out, so we end up with a thinner mix. Okay, so we need to set up a couple of things here. First thing I'm going to set up is a correlation meter. Next thing I'm going to set up just before that correlation meter is another gain plugin. Now, the correlation meter is a very simple thing. All we want to worry about is keeping the little line here towards the right hand side, towards the plus, towards the green. Anything above 0 means that you haven't got phase cancellation issues. The further towards 1 you get, the better in terms of the difference between the left and the right and how well they'll sum to mono. Okay, so if we listen to this at the moment, we're hoping that our line is going to stay towards this right hand side and towards +1. Let's bring all of our channels back in. So you can see we're well towards that +1 number, which is great. Let's just show a little bit more of a section. So really healthy, really happy. You'll see that if I hit this mono button, what's going to happen is this meter will just sit on 1. Okay, it's just going to stay there, meaning there's absolutely no issues between the left and the right side because they're exactly the same. So there are no phase cancellation issues. Let's show you that. As you can hear, obviously, there's a great difference in terms of what we're hearing, because with the stereo image engaged, we've got differences in the left and right sides of our mix, which are coming from our overheads having different content on the left and right, our rooms having different content on the left and right, and also the bits of panning that we've done on these 3 other channels. So that's where the stereo content's coming from. See, when we fold that to mono, we're then hearing the exact same thing in both sides of our mix, which makes it sound very narrow. But the important thing is that we're not losing anything from our mix. We can still hear every component in that mix very clearly. So I can still hear the kick, I can still hear the snare, I can still hear the cymbals, I can still hear the toms. So just listen to that once more. So monocompatibility is a really important thing to pay attention to all the way through your mixing process. Anytime you do something that you think might affect or might worry how your track will fold down to mono, check it. Have your correlation meter set up, have a simple gain plugin instantiated where you can just hit your mono maker right there, and then you can check it. So there you go. There's a whole load of really important stuff that is really, really crucial that you know and understand. It's going to make you a much better mix engineer and help you get better mixes time and time again. I'll be back very soon with the next part in this series. Again, if you haven't hit the thumbs up or subscribed or hit the bell, please do that now, and I'll see you again very soon.